forest clearing is silent, save for the wind. Mist clings to the ground, rising with the cold dawn. Two figures stand opposite each other, their forms statuesque beneath the towering pines. They are samurai, clad in silk and steel. One bows, the movement as precise as a ritual. The other's hand glides to the hilt of his katana, the sound of the blade unsheathing a whisper of steel on wood. The air stills. A single cherry blossom drifts between them. Steel flashes. This is what you were told the samurai lived by. Honor, discipline, death before disgrace. But what if I told you this scene, this code, this story was written after the sword was sheathed? Not to honor the samurai, but to repurpose them. To understand the lie, you must first understand the reality. We love to picture the samurai as noble knights, but for centuries, they were little more than warlords, mercenaries, and professional killers. Their world was not one of serene duels and honorable last stands. It was a world of chaos, of betrayal, and of constant brutal war. This was the Sengoku period, a time of warring states. Loyalty was a fluid currency, and the blade in your hand was a tool to serve yourself, not a divine code. A samurai would pledge his allegiance to one lord in the morning, and by nightfall he could be plotting his assassination if a better offer came along. Think of the Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600, the largest samurai clash in history, with over 160,000 warriors on the field. The fate of Japan hung in the balance, but this epic war was not decided by courage or strength. It was decided by a calculated act of treachery. Halfway through the battle, a general named Kobayakawa Hideaki, who had pledged his loyalty to one side, betrayed his allies. He switched his entire army, turning their swords on their former brothers in arms. This single act of calculated treachery decided the course of the war and paved the way for a new shogun. Honor didn't win that day. Treachery did. The samurai you were told to admire were masters of assassination, hostage-taking, and brutal ambushes. Their job was to enforce taxes, crush peasant revolts with ruthless force, and seize land. They were not philosophers. They were political weapons, and their swords served only one master: power. Bushidō, the noble code of conduct you've heard so much about, didn't exist to restrain them because it didn't exist. Not in the way we know it today. The chaos could not last forever. In 1603, the Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan. The country closed its borders, and an era of unprecedented peace descended for over 250 years. The battles ended. The swords were no longer needed, and the samurai, the professional warrior class, were left with nothing to fight. But they kept their status, they kept their stipends, and they kept their swords. So what did the warrior class become? They became bureaucrats. They traded their swords for ink brushes, their battlefield tactics for paperwork. By the 18th century, the average samurai had never drawn his katana in anger. They managed rice warehouses, audited taxes, and served as administrators for a peaceful government. Their children were educated in reading and writing, not in warfare. This is when the idea of Bushidō, a code of honor, began to harden. Not as a call to arms, but as a way to preserve dignity. When the battlefield was gone, the focus of honor shifted. It was no longer about how you fought, but about how you behaved, how you wore your sword, how you spoke to your superiors, how you performed your duties. It was a ritual to preserve a forgotten identity. The samurai of this period were not serene, deadly warriors. They were office clerks with 2 swords on their belt. The reality of their lives was not epic combat, but the slow, mundane crawl of bureaucracy. The feudal system that supported the samurai class could not last. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration swept through Japan, dismantling the old order. The emperor was restored to power, and with a single stroke of a pen, the samurai lost everything. Their status, their stipends, their swords. Less than a decade later, in 1877, those dispossessed samurai made a final, desperate stand. At the Battle of Shiroyama, a few hundred rebels, led by the charismatic Saigo Takamori, faced a modern imperial army of over 30,000 men. The samurai charged a line of rifles and artillery. They were not fighting a glorious duel. They were being cut down by bullets and cannon fire, their katanas useless against the might of the modern war machine. Their defeat was not a noble last stand, it was a tragic, inevitable end. Their death, however, became something else entirely. It became a monument. Japan was rapidly modernizing and needed a new story, a legend to unite a broken people and preserve a sense of pride. In 1899, a Christian scholar named Nitobe Inazo, who had studied in the West, published a book titled Bushidō, The Soul of Japan. Nitobe was not a warrior. He had never fought a day in his life, but he provided Japan and the West with what they wanted, a clean, noble, and romanticized version of the samurai. His Bushidō was a blend of Eastern values and Western ideals, emphasizing self-restraint, sacrifice, and moral clarity. It was a beautiful fiction, and most importantly, it was a marketable lie. Nitobe's book became an international sensation. In the West, it was admired. In Japan, it was weaponized. The new imperial government saw the myth of Bushidō as more than a historical curiosity. It was the perfect tool for propaganda. The samurai's code was taken, twisted, and repurposed to serve the state. Textbooks taught children that their ancestors lived by this sacred code of virtue and sacrifice. Military schools used it to train an entire generation of obedient soldiers, instilling in them a willingness to die for the emperor without question. The concepts of loyalty, honor, and obedience were no longer about serving a local lord, they were about serving the nation. Bushidō became the moral justification for conquest, for imperial expansion, for the utter subjugation of the individual to the state. It was no longer a philosophical ideal, it was a national identity, a call to arms for an entire empire. The myth of the samurai was used to prepare Japan for total war. The legacy of Bushidō didn't end with the samurai. It evolved into something colder, something far more terrifying. By the 1930s, Imperial Japan had become a total militarist state. And Bushidō, now fully institutionalized and taught from birth, was no longer a way of life. It was a suicide pact. Soldiers were indoctrinated to believe that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that they must kill themselves rather than be captured. The most horrifying manifestation of this twisted ideology was the kamikaze pilot. These young men, many of them barely out of high school, were told they were the modern-day samurai. Their one-way mission was not a glorious battle. It was an act of self-annihilation. Imagine it, a boy in a cockpit, his hands shaking as he grips the controls. He is told he is fighting a glorious battle. Below him, an American ship, bristling with guns, awaits. He dives. Metal screams. His final moments are not of victory or honor, but of a horrifying one-way descent into steel and ocean. This was not the noble death of a warrior. It was the execution of a myth, a lie used to send thousands of boys to their deaths. After the war ended, after the bombings, the defeat, the trials, Japan buried its militarist past. But not Bushidō. The ideology that sent boys to die was quietly rebranded. It became cultural, aesthetic, safe. The wartime slogans were gone, but the samurai still stood tall in textbooks. The violence was edited out, the obedience reframed as discipline, the death rewritten as duty. The myth was too useful to let die. Today, the samurai thrives, not in scrolls or shrines. From video games to anime and movies, we've turned the myth into a profitable brand. We love the stoicism, the katana, the quiet strength. We want to believe in a world where honor is absolute and courage is pure. But we rarely ask, whose version are we seeing? Is it the assassin from the Sengoku period? The tax collector from the Tokugawa? The rebellious swordsman fighting a losing battle against the modern world? Or is it a sanitized, marketable hero created by Hollywood? Bushidō survived because it sells a story we desperately want to believe, that we can inherit the glory without inheriting the sin. But the armor is empty. Bushidō was never a living code of warriors at their peak. It was a political tool, written after the battles were over. It was a way to give violence dignity, to turn obedience into philosophy, and to make sacrifice seem sacred. The samurai were real. The Bushidō we know today was the costume, and it still echoes through pop culture, through nationalism, through the stories we choose to tell. So next time someone says, the samurai lived by a noble code, ask them, which one? The warrior thief? The paper-pushing bureaucrat? The rebellious swordsman fighting a losing battle against the modern world? Or the terrified boy in a cockpit? Because the warriors never needed Bushidō. They had power. It was only when they lost that power that their story was rewritten, not to honor them, but to use them. History isn't always what happened. Sometimes it's what someone needed you to believe. History remembers what it's told, but we're here to tell what it forgets. Like and subscribe to see what they left out.